Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, CEO of Boardroom Resources, and your host for the show. Today's going to be a very interesting show. We are happy to have Bloomberg News visit Inside America's Boardrooms, and it's my pleasure to introduce Alicia Ritcey, who's the reporter and analyst for Bloomberg News. Welcome, Alicia.
Thank you for having me.
So, I must say this is the first time that we've sort of invited the media to Inside America's Boardrooms, so it's certainly a pleasure that you're representing the media on this.
Thank you. It's a big task.
So it must be a very interesting time to be a reporter in the business world. Obviously, we have a lot of changes to regs. We got an administration change, which I guess is maybe the biggest issue. Activists are on. They're as busy as ever, targeting companies. You've got the large institutional shareholders feeling pretty good after the Dodd-Frank, and they feel empowered, to have their message now. You have gender parity is very strong in the markets right now. You hear a lot of that coming. And in addition to that, you have our president tweeting away. Moving markets, it seems. One tweet can change things pretty significantly. So talk about a little bit about what it's like to be a reporter covering businesses and boards today.
So it's definitely an interesting time, and there's a lot to consider, what you had just mentioned. But just to kind of take a step back, where companies and boards are reporting is that you kind of saw a kind of settling in post-2008 up to today, where companies, and our reporting was really following the trend. How are they adopting, Dodd-Frank? How are they abiding by common practices? What are the best practices that are coming through? Maybe not just on a regulatory side, but being pushed by shareholders. And so in terms of covering those issues, we've definitely been able to see the range of experiences on behalf of companies and boards, those that are really excelling and taking hold of the issues, and we've been covering them well. But then we also have to cover the opposite side, and maybe who isn't abiding by the same best practices. And in Bloomberg News especially, our motivation is to come from a fact-based evidence perspective. So when we, think about covering the boards, of course we're going to look at a recent tweet or a press release or a filing, and then we want to take that information and really figure out, drill down to say, what is the content here? What's important to investors? What's important to shareholders? And how can we, through this range of sources, tweets, reports, what it may be, provide the best context to our readers?
Yeah. So that's a good segue into one of the questions that I have, because I've either been on boards or worked with boards for 30 plus years. And there's always been this feel or this relationship between business and senior management and boards and the media, that there's the perception that there's some sensationalism, that if, particularly in compensation and executive compensation, what's going to have a good headline, what's going to capture people's attention. So there's a fear of exaggeration of how big this issue is or whatever. But for purposes of our audience, what I was hoping that you would be able to do is to sort of give a picture to all that. Like, what happens when everybody's in the newsroom, or in the meeting in the newsroom, like you see in the movies, okay? So what discussions are there? What's somebody looking for? Can you share just a little bit of that? And also, I don't know how long you've been in the business, but I'm sure you work with people that go back quite a ways to not only 2008 and 2009, but also pre-then, okay, when directors' reputation was maybe a lot higher, okay? It took a hit during those periods. But can you talk about what happens at those meetings and sort of what some of your other colleagues might think about?
Yes, definitely. So yeah, a little bit about myself. So this is my third year in like the newsroom, working day to day, you know, on the wire, trying to get things out. And then previously I came from the corporate governance side with the proxy advisors. So it's more the background and the expertise there to apply, you know, that knowledge into the newsroom setting. So for myself, you know, fairly recent. But what we do, sometimes it's very much spur of the moment. There's a proxy filing that drops, and immediately there could be, you know, several editors, several reporters, few analysts, you know, scouring that document, trying to find out what information is going. And prior to that filing dropping, there's the anticipation of that coming. So in the meetings beforehand, there's a review, okay, what's expected, you know, who's going to file, what has been happening in previous years, what's been happening in the market. So really trying to get a context of whatever the information is going to be presented with when that filing or report exists. So some of the back end is all of that data gathering beforehand, you know, making sure we have the right information to provide the context. When it comes to, so that's today, when it comes to kind of yesterday, it was the same process, you know, which companies are in the news right now, what's moving markets right now, where's the interest and focus. But another issue that, you know, going back to your comment about like sensationalism, is that a lot of what news is to say, what's the outliers? You know, a lot of companies are subscribing to the same practices. And so, you know, who's operating on one end of the spectrum and who's operating on the other end of the spectrum. And that's where in those like newsroom meetings, you try and decipher, okay, what's happening in this, you know, broad perspective, and how can we get that to our readers, while also making it condensed to a point where the reader's still engaged, that it isn't too much into, of course, we want to focus very heavily on information and data, but how can we pick the right information and data that's important to the readers and investors? So today versus yesterday in terms of how we approach reporting is a little bit different, but when it comes to the regulations, as you said, right, in 2008, you know, how were the companies going to adopt these practices? Who is going to be the first leaders? And now we're seeing, okay, who's sustaining the trend, and maybe who's coming out as, you know, the true, like the top performers. Yeah. Like one example when it comes to CEO pay and like clawback regulations, you know, those aren't in right now as a final rule, but you do see most companies, definitely S&P 500, having clawback policies, some clawback policies expanding beyond just the restatements into reputational risk. And so taking that into a newsroom setting or an article setting, you have the Wells Fargo clawbacks in August. And so how did we approach that? Well, the information of the false accounts came out, and then it wasn't enough to create a restatement, but the question existed because the board started to get involved and this was some reputational harm. So we had company news reporters working on it, we had pay reporters working on it, we had finance reporters working on it. So it's a huge collaboration in the newsroom where everyone's looking at maybe the same documents but coming at it from different angles to provide this robust coverage.
It certainly was a big story.
Yeah.
I mean, that wasn't a surprise. But your point sort of drives home my point in that it's the outliers, and it could be 98% of the board members are doing what's right and doing right by their responsibilities, their fiduciary duties, by the shareholders. But that 2% outliers, it shows you the power of the media because it can cast a shadow over the whole industry of board members by what certain individuals do.
Yeah.
And that will always be the relationship because it's interesting when somebody's company has performed and they still get $100 million, dollar payout. Anyway, it's good to know that the movies are accurate, with what happens.
There's definitely collaboration, and and actually to that point, it'll be interesting to see how even directors can be pushing the news. Those who are in that 98%, of course, we want to profile in companies, directors that are performing at their best abilities, and so maybe they too could come out and start, talking about their peers and saying how they perform.
Yeah, maybe I'll have to push some of the 98% your way, right?
Yeah.
So my last question is looking at you. So here you are, you're in the mix of this. So what's your perception when you're on the, quote, boardroom beat? What do you find fascinating about what's happening in the boardroom today?
Yeah, so several great topics to discuss right now. I'm definitely partial to CEO pay. I think it's very interesting because lately we've seen high CEO pay outpacing income growth, high disparity. So there's a lot to disparity in the workforce and nationally. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens because there's been somewhat of a almost a leveling out, like a homogeneity when it comes to pay plans. And it really is about the ultimate quantum that's being paid. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with equity compensation, whether or not there's going to be really unique plans that come out in the next few years to kind of shake the mix up a bit, because right now it all seems to be converging. But another place still in the pay realm is the pay for performance and those rules that are coming out, the CEO pay ratio, that coming out, some shareholder proposals about diversity and pay. I also think, just to stray a little bit away from pay and look at corporate governance broadly, what's happening in sustainability and broadly diversity on the board, diversity in the workforce. But then also we've been looking at, there's been a push to have more sustainability disclosures. So what's going to happen with, boards in terms of what's happening regulatory, and then being more of a thought leader and pushing the practices. So that's kind of where my interest is in coverage right now and what's going to be happening in the future.
Well, be prepared, because as the stock market goes up, all boats rise.
Yes.
Whether they've really had great performance or not, which is one of the challenges about this. But Alicia, thank you for taking the time to join us here at the NASDAQ market site. We appreciate you joining us and giving us insight into the media.
Thank you very much.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.